I was in the middle of a perfectly civilized Sunday afternoon, civilized in the Wolfe sense, which means I was trying not to inhale the aroma of his exotic herbs while he paced in slow circles, murmuring about a new strain of saffron he was contemplating for dinner when the doorbell rang. Not a polite, ordinary ring, but a demanding, businesslike chime that seemed to say, "Something unusual is about to happen, and you'd better be alert." I glanced at Wolfe, who hadn't moved from his chair by the window. His eyes were half-lidded, his expression one of deliberate disinterest. "Archie," he said, without glancing at me, "the door. And make it civil." I am attempting to imagine the subtle interplay between nutmeg and saffron. Civil, I thought, though I knew full well Wolfe considered any interruption an act of aggression against the brownstone. I opened the door to find a young woman, impeccably dressed, holding a small box with both hands as though it contained a bomb or, at least, a culinary treasure. She looked nervous, not in a cliché way, but in the precise, measured manner of someone weighing the consequences of every word. "I'm Miss Clarissa Pembroke," she said, voice tight. "I was told you could help." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if the hall itself were listening. "It's about my father's restaurant and the chef." I raised an eyebrow. Wolfe, as I suspected, didn't even flick an eyelid. I gave her the standard Goodwin greeting smile, which rarely comforted anyone, but at least let them know I wasn't a threat. "And what's gone wrong at the restaurant, Miss Pembroke?" She opened the small box on the table. Inside was a glove, not unusual in itself, except the fingers had been carefully cut off, leaving empty sheaths where the chef's dexterity should have been. "This," she said, her voice trembling, "was found in the kitchen after my father returned from a brief errand. Our chef, he's gone missing. And this was left behind." Wolfe leaned forward, steepling his fingers, eyes narrowing in the way that made even the simplest observation feel like a philosophical challenge. "Glove," he said, his voice smooth, calculating. "Size, material, cut." "Do you know the brand?" "No," she admitted, "but I can get it." "I only found it this morning." Wolfe considered, then turned to me. "Archie, note the obvious and the overlooked. We have a missing person, a truncated glove, and familial distress. The usual police channels have evidently failed to yield satisfactory results, or Miss Pembroke would not be here." "Yes, sir," I said, jotting down notes. I kept one eye on Wolfe, who had resumed his slow, meditative pacing. Miss Pembroke swallowed. "I was told you don't usually, but I had no choice. My father insisted. He fears sabotage. There have been other incidents, burned dishes, missing ingredients, but nothing like this." Wolfe stopped, the faintest curl of amusement flickering across his lips. "Sabotage," he mused, "a culinary crime with, potentially, physical consequences. Most intriguing. And your father believes the chef's disappearance is connected?" "Yes," she said. "And the glove, it's not just a glove. It's threatening. There were letters, instructions, demands." I leaned back, putting a hand over my mouth to suppress the smirk. Threatening letters, a missing chef, a severed glove. It was the kind of melodrama Wolfe relished dissecting. The problem, of course, was that he'd let me sweat it out first. Wolfe folded his hands on the arm of his chair. "Miss Pembroke, I will consider your case. My acceptance will depend not on your urgency, but on my personal interest." "One moment." He sat silently, eyes closed, as if meditating not on saffron, but on the human penchant for error, mischief, and villainy. I waited, which was never a problem, though I could hear the tick of the wall clock matching the rapid pulse in Miss Pembroke's throat. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes. "I will take the case. Not because I find your predicament particularly palatable," he said, glancing at the glove, "but because I detect perceptibly, if faintly, a series of patterns deserving scrutiny. Archie, Prepare to accompany our client to the restaurant at once. She will provide the details en route. Miss Pembroke exhaled, relief breaking through her nervous tension. Oh, thank you, Mr. Wolfe. My father, he'll be so grateful. Gratitude, Wolfe said without inflection, is irrelevant. Observation and deduction are not. And just like that, the air of domestic tranquility in the brownstone shifted. I grabbed my coat, eyes on the young woman whose composure now betrayed both fear and resolve. As we stepped out onto the street, I caught Wolfe's gaze briefly from the window. He was immovable, yet the faintest quiver of his lip suggested he was already several steps ahead, calculating, aligning, and setting the stage for what promised to be a very particular kind of intellectual hunt. I had a feeling that what awaited us at that restaurant would involve more than missing fingers and threatening letters. This, I thought, was going to be one of those cases where nothing was as it seemed, and everyone's motives would be measured, masked, and deadly precise. The cab rattled along the uneven streets of Midtown, and I kept one eye on Miss Pembroke while the other monitored the passing storefronts, street vendors, and the occasional gawker who seemed convinced that anyone exiting a cab in front of a restaurant with a suspiciously perfumed young woman must be involved in some clandestine drama. She fidgeted with the strap of her handbag, betraying the anxiety she was trying hard to hide. The restaurant, she said softly, isn't far. My father prefers discretion. There's been incidents, nothing violent, not yet, but disturbing enough that he's afraid to handle it himself. I nodded, offering the standard Goodwin smile, which in practice was a mixture of empathy and quiet skepticism. I got the picture. Missing chef, threatening letters, fingers on gloves, I'm all ears, and Wolfe, of course, will have a field day with this. Wolfe? She asked, glancing at me, as if I were a part of some bizarre apparatus she had yet to understand. The detective, I explained lightly. Tall, sits a lot, speaks even less than he thinks. But he's brilliant. You'll see? She managed a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I understood. Fear has a long reach, and when it's mixed with responsibility, it can twist even the most confident posture into something brittle. When we arrived at the restaurant, the door opened before we could knock. Mr. Pembroke himself appeared, a man whose presence was immediately commanding yet tinged with a perpetual worry. Mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, eyes sharp despite the worry lines around them. He sized me up in an instant detectives often do, and then followed Miss Pembroke inside without a word. Inside, the restaurant was spotless, almost eerily so, and yet I could sense a tension in the air. Something was off. The usual warmth of a family-owned establishment, rich smells, the soft clatter of preparation was replaced with an anxious hush. The kitchen door, normally open in invitation, was closed, and the faint, metallic scent of disinfectant lingered. Wolfe, of course, had already arrived, or rather, he had never left the brownstone. But I knew his mind was now engaged fully, orchestrating from a distance. It's the kind of power he wields, silent, strategic, and absolutely controlling. Mr. Pembroke gestured for us to sit at a small table near the front. Archie, Miss Pembroke tells me you're here to investigate, he said, his voice tight. I don't understand how Wolfe works, but she insisted. I'll do my part, I said. And Wolfe, well, he'll need a report later, but he prefers the details to come through observation rather than theatrics. Mr. Pembroke nodded, clearly unsure whether to feel comforted or more anxious. Miss Pembroke pulled a small notebook from her bag, and I noticed she had recorded times, dates, and incidents with the precision of someone determined to prove herself right while fearing she might not be believed. Over the past month, she said, there have been unusual events. Ingredients disappearing, dishes ruined just before service, and hints, threats. Nothing has been violent until now. The chef, Mr. Claude Darnell, went missing yesterday morning, The glove, or what remains of it, was left in the prep area. The letters, they suggest someone wanted him gone, and fast. I leaned back, letting her words settle. There's a rhythm to the way people reveal information, pauses, repetitions, emphasis on seemingly minor details. That's where the real truth hides. "Any idea who might want him gone?" I asked. Mr. Pembroke shifted uncomfortably. "No one, at least not openly. Claude was excellent, loyal, and respected. Yet there's always ambition, jealousy. This is a kitchen, a small world where every hand, every spice, every technique matters." Miss Pembroke opened her notebook again. "There are 4 other employees who might have motives if motives exist. Sous chef Bernard, pastry chef Lila, a waiter named Thomas, and the dishwasher, a man called Reggie. All talented, all with their own quirks. I made mental notes, a compact circle of suspects, each with proximity to the victim and potential reasons for discontent. Perfect for Wolfe's style of methodical deduction. "Let's see the kitchen," I said, standing. The restaurant was small, so the kitchen took up the rear quarter of the building, separated by a swinging door. The scent hit immediately clean, slightly antiseptic, but beneath it a faint hint of something burned. A testy aroma, the sort that suggests trouble recently occurred. I noticed the prep tables had been meticulously cleaned, yet there was one area where the cleaning seemed hurried-some. Flour still clung stubbornly to the edges, and the remnants of a broken egg lay on a tray. Someone had been interrupted. The glove was displayed on the counter. It was indeed cut at the fingers, precise and deliberate, not a frenzied act. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, purposeful intimidation, not a crime of passion. I made a quick circuit, noting positions, surfaces, and angles. Every detail would matter when Wolfe started asking questions, especially the spatial relationships in a small kitchen where movement is tightly choreographed. "Have the police been informed?" I asked. Mr. Pembroke nodded. "Yes, but they consider it a minor matter. He's missing. Yes, but no one's harmed yet. The letters don't scream immediate threat. That's why we came here, to you." I looked at Miss Pembroke. "Do you trust anyone here implicitly?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I want to, but right now I fear all of them, and yet none seems capable of this." Claude was careful, thorough. If someone wanted him gone, they had to plan meticulously. I nodded. A careful plan, a compact group of suspects, and an intangible threat, classic ingredients for Wolfe to work his magic. Meanwhile, I took mental snapshots of faces, gestures, inflections. Later, Wolfe would report contradictions, pauses, nervous habits. "Archie," Mr. Pembroke said, lowering his voice, "please do whatever is necessary." If Claude is in danger, his words falter. There was fear there, tempered with authority. A father's fear, a man aware of the precarious balance between loyalty and ambition in his small empire. I reassured him lightly. "We'll find him, don't worry. Wolfe sees the patterns, I can't. And I follow the people he once watched," Miss Pembroke added quietly. "I just want him back, whole, safe, and for this madness to stop." I glanced at the glove again, then at the empty space on the prep counter, where it had been placed. Someone had crossed a line, and Wolfe, though physically absent, would sense it. He always did. My job was to keep the wheels turning, the observations flowing, and the suspects under a subtle, unnoticed surveillance until Wolfe decided to intervene. I left the restaurant with more questions than answers, the weight of the kitchen's tension settling like dust on my shoulders. Wolfe's calm, immovable presence at the brownstone would soon make the difference between intuition and certainty, between speculation and truth. And I knew deep down that the brownstone's sacred order had already been disturbed by a ripple that promised to grow if not contained, and Wolfe Never let such ripples go unchecked. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was already in position, reclining in his chair like a king, surveying a kingdom he could not be forced to leave. He regarded the world with that peculiar mix of disdain and curiosity, as if the very air of crime offended him personally, yet invited him to explore its patterns. I set down my notes from the restaurant and recounted the details to him, carefully selecting the sequence that would feed his deductive appetite without skipping a single necessary step. He didn't move, didn't respond at first, which is his way of making you sweat. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised a finger. Archie, a chef gone missing, a severed glove, and 4 principal suspects. This Bernard, Lila, Thomas, Reggie, correct? Yes, sir, I said, spreading the list across the table. Sous chef Bernard is meticulous, a stickler for order. Lila, the pastry chef, is brilliant but temperamental. Thomas, the waiter, has been angling for a promotion. Reggie, the dishwasher, is quiet, keeps to himself but seems resentful. Wolfe tapped his fingers together. We have proximity, potential motive, and temperament. Observe, Archie, how small variables can yield large consequences. The kitchen is a microcosm. Each individual's role is vital, each movement observed, each frustration stored. I nodded, knowing he was framing the problem in his mind like a chessboard. I had my own task, keep a record of faces, gestures, and words. Every twitch, every hesitation, every choice of phrase could feed into his ultimate configuration of truth. I began with Bernard, who greeted me with a tight smile and a firm handshake. His hands were clean, his uniform impeccable. Sous chef Bernard, I said, mind if I ask a few questions about Claude's disappearance? His eyes flicked nervously, though he maintained composure. I've answered the police, but I suppose I can speak with you. I want Claude back as much as anyone. Of course, I said. Tell me about yesterday morning. I arrived at my usual hour. Claude was already in the kitchen. We discussed prep for the evening menu. I left briefly to check deliveries. When I returned, he hesitated, then swallowed. He was gone. The glove, yes, I saw it. I didn't touch it. I thought someone might be playing a prank. I noted the hesitation, the choice of words, and playing a prank. Curious. Most professionals would have immediately assumed something more serious, and anyone you can think of who might have wanted to frighten him. Bernard shook his head firmly. No one. Claude was well, he had standards. If anything, he tolerated mistakes poorly, but he was fair. Next was Lila, who had been dusting flour from her hands when I approached. She looked at me with a mixture of irritation and apprehension. Pastry chef Lila, I began. Claude is missing. Any thoughts? She exhaled sharply. Thoughts? Everyone panics too easily. Claude's gone, yes, but he's clever. He might have taken a brief leave without telling us. He's precise. And the glove? I asked. Her face flickered. Anger? Fear? A warning? Or a joke? I don't know. I didn't touch it. I left it at that. Lila's posture suggested a layered complexity. Talented, proud, perhaps insecure about her position, yet unwilling to betray any personal feeling outright. Thomas, the waiter, was next. He had a sly, calculated grin and an easy manner, though I suspected it masked more than it revealed. Claude's missing, I said bluntly. Any idea why? He leaned against the counter, elbows brushing the polished surface. Claude had fans and enemies alike. Me? I liked him. But others' ambition bites harder than knives in a kitchen, I'd say. But I swear I had nothing to do with it. Ambition, I muttered as I wrote notes. Thomas's language was indirect, reflective of a mind skilled at diplomacy or deception. Finally, Reggie, the dishwasher, a large man with quiet eyes that seemed to watch without being watched. Reggie, I said, you work here daily. Any insight into what happened to Claude? He shrugged. I saw the glove. I didn't touch it. I hear things. People argue. People want things. not me. I studied with him. Calm, collected, almost invisible. The kind of person who could move through chaos unnoticed or use it deliberately. After my interviews, I returned to the brownstone, carrying impressions, contradictions, and subtle cues. Wolfe was waiting. "Well?" he asked, without looking up from his chair. I began to report the hesitations, the word choices, the body language. Wolfe listened with his characteristic serenity, occasionally raising a single brow, letting the information settle like sediment in water. "Archie," he said finally, "we have 4 principal suspects, each with access, proximity, and potential motive. But motive is never enough. Method and opportunity are the skeleton keys." I nodded, feeding him more details. "The glove," I said, "was cleanly severed, not accidental. Someone wanted Claude intimidated, perhaps removed temporarily or permanently from the kitchen. All 4 suspects had access, but not all had the skill or daring to execute such a precise act." Wolfe's eyes gleamed faintly. Precision, fear, subtle threat, excellent. And the atmosphere, did you notice? Each one projected an image of innocence, yet the tension that is unspoken reveals the truth. I want everything in writing, arrival times, gestures, words, omissions. Every variable noted, we will construct a model of this microcosm, and the pattern will reveal the culprit. I scribbled notes rapidly, knowing Wolfe's mind was already running several steps ahead. The circle of suspects was closed, but their true nature was only beginning to be revealed. I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation, the one that came just before Wolfe set his traps, and I was the piece sliding along the board, executing his design. Outside, the evening began to settle into shadows, the city's hum a low, constant reminder that life went on, indifferent to missing chefs and truncated gloves. Inside, the brownstone remained a sanctuary of intellect, observation, and unflinching judgment. Wolfe, as always, would wait, watch, and ultimately manipulate events with the patience of a predator. I could feel the tension coiling, ready to snap, and I knew that the next step, careful, deliberately, and hidden, would draw out the truth in ways no ordinary detective could foresee. The morning after my interviews, I returned to the restaurant with a notebook full of impressions and a head full of questions. Wolfe, true to form, had given me minimal instructions to observe, report, and do not under any circumstances intervene physically. In other words, my job was to become the eyes and ears of his mind while he orchestrated from the brownstone. I arrived just as deliveries were being brought in. The city outside was brisk, indifferent, the kind of backdrop that made the drama inside the small restaurant all the more intense. I slipped in quietly, nodding to the staff, who all seemed to carry a combination of fear and curiosity. I started with Bernard, who was prepping vegetables with meticulous care. "Good morning, Bernard," I said casually. "A few follow-up questions, if you don't mind." He straightened slightly, a flicker of apprehension crossing his face. "Of course, anything to help find Claude. Tell me about yesterday afternoon. Who did you interact with and for how long?" Bernard recited a list, precise and orderly, but I noted tiny contradictions. A 5-minute gap where he claimed to have been checking the delivery van, yet no one corroborated that he left the kitchen. Subtle, but exactly the kind of detail Wolfe would latch onto. Next, I shadowed Lila. She was in her element, rolling dough and decorating pastries, yet there was tension in the air. Her movements were rapid, almost nervous. "Lila," I said softly, "how do you feel about the current staff dynamic?" She gave me a long look. "Claude's gone, and everything feels unbalanced. People whisper, worry, speculate. I just want to do my job." Her hands trembled slightly as she finished frosting a cake, though she tried to mask it. I took note of anxiety masked as professionalism. Often, that's where guilt or fear hides. Thomas, the waiter, was easier to approach. He had a practiced charm, smooth as silk, but I detected small slips. His eyes lingered too long on the prep area, as if measuring opportunity. "Thomas," I said, "any changes in behavior among the staff since Claude disappeared?" "People are tense," he said, "but I keep things professional, always have." He smiled, but his knuckles whitened on the tray he carried. Subtle, but the tension betrayed him. Finally, Reggie, the dishwasher, quiet, reserved, almost invisible. I observed him without speaking at first, noting the precision with which he handled dishes, the way he avoided confrontation yet watched everyone. I asked casually, "Reggie, anyone acting oddly in the kitchen?" He shrugged, eyes steady. "People act like people. Some are nervous, some care, nothing I can say for sure." I left the restaurant mid-morning, my notebook heavier with observations. Outside, I felt the city breathe around me, indifferent and constant. My next step was to verify the small inconsistencies in delivery logs, timing, and personnel schedules. Wolfe had emphasized patterns. Every repeated gesture, every pause, every subtle deviation could be the key to unlocking this puzzle. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, as immovable as a statue. I laid out my observations, emphasizing the gaps, the contradictions, and the nervous habits. He listened silently, fingers steepled, eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Archie," he said finally, "your work confirms my anticipation of a small circle of suspects, each with potential motive and opportunity. Yet the methods and signals are subtle. You've identified the cracks, the unspoken tensions, the inconsistencies. We will exploit these." I nodded, knowing that exploitation in Wolfe's hands didn't mean confrontation, but rather strategic pressure. He thrived on the psychological dimension, coaxing information from people without ever seeming to push. My role was to gather what he could manipulate. I spent the afternoon retracing steps deliveries, entry logs, supplier schedules. A pattern emerged, small but telling. Bernard and Thomas crossed paths more often than they admitted. Lila had a brief but unexplained absence during prep hours. Reggie's shifts overlapped with late-night cleanings that seemed unusually meticulous. Each detail might have been innocuous on its own, but together they suggested someone was manipulating the environment, preparing for something, or covering tracks. By evening, I had a clearer picture of interpersonal tensions. Bernard's precision bordered on obsession, his irritation at minor mistakes nearly visible. Lila's artistry and temper made her capable of calculated sabotage if she chose. Thomas's charm masked ambition and impatience. Reggie's quiet observation suggested either innocence or cunning restraint. I reported everything to Wolfe. He considered the information, reclining in his chair, the faint scent of his favorite cigars wafting in the room. "Patterns, Archie. Connections, movements, hesitations, subtle signals tell us more than words ever could. Now," he added, "we prepare to see which of these signals reveals the underlying truth. Your continued observation will be crucial." I left him then with instructions to follow, and note but not interfere. Outside, the city had shifted to evening rhythm, streetlights glowing amber, and the hum of traffic providing a constant soundtrack. I felt the tension in the restaurant, the energy of restrained ambition, and the unseen pressure waiting to snap. It was precisely the environment Wolfe thrived in, controlled chaos, ripe for deduction. The next day promised more clues, more contradictions, and a slow tightening of the circle. And somewhere in that mix, hidden behind smiles, glances, and carefully chosen words, was the identity of the person who had removed the chef from the kitchen and left a warning in the form of a truncated glove. Wolfe's strategy was unfolding, and I was merely the conduit. But in this dance of intellect and observation, every step mattered. It was late afternoon when I returned to the restaurant, notebook in hand and senses alert. Wolfe had instructed me to observe the staff during a full shift, noting the smallest deviations from routine. He called it reading the invisible script. In practice, it meant hours of watching, listening, and cataloguing human behavior, often without the participants even realizing they were being scrutinized. The kitchen, normally a place of constant motion and controlled chaos, had an almost eerie precision tonight. Bernard moved with mechanical efficiency, chopping vegetables in a rhythm that was faster than necessary, as if he were attempting to assert dominance over the empty spaces Claude had left. Lila glided between counters, her movements elegant, yet tight with tension, eyes darting at corners, hands trembling slightly as she handled delicate pastries. Thomas floated through the dining room, trays balanced effortlessly, but I noticed him glancing repeatedly toward the kitchen doorway, each glance lingering an extra second. Reggie remained in the shadows near the dish area, quiet, unassuming, but attentive to every sound, every whisper. I made my rounds quietly, observing, asking innocuous questions, and noting subtle reactions. Bernard flinched at a comment about ingredient stock. Lila's composure cracked for a moment when I mentioned Claude's meticulous recipes. Thomas smiled too widely at a joke I made about kitchen politics, and Reggie's eyes flicked in my direction once, the only acknowledgement of my presence. Then I noticed something peculiar. The spice rack along the wall, normally ordered alphabetically, had been subtly rearranged. A few jars were out of place, paprika and cayenne swapped. Thyme slightly misaligned, a faint smear of flour on the top shelf. Minor, almost laughable to anyone else, but Wolfe had trained me to see these small irregularities as potentially deliberate. I crouched slightly to examine a cupboard, my movement catching a flicker of shadow from the corner of my eye. A folded note slipped from behind the jars. Carefully I retrieved it. The note was brief, written in a neat hand, and read, "Some ingredients must vanish before the next. Service, or hands will be idle." A chill ran down my spine. Someone was playing a game, not just with Claude, but with the entire kitchen. The warning was clear interference, intimidation, and a psychological message that extended beyond mere theft. I pocketed the note and continued my observations. Bernard's chopping continued, slightly uneven now, hands betraying frustration. Lila's pastries had subtle imperfections, the glazes slightly uneven, as if she were distracted by something more urgent than her artistry. Thomas was polite, overly accommodating, yet there was an underlying tension in the way he moved between tables. Reggie remained a silent observer, but the way he aligned plates on the drying rack suggested an almost ritualistic attention to detail, as if signaling compliance or defiance, I couldn't tell which. I spent the next hour tracing small clues, flour on the floor leading from the prep counter to a side door, tiny droplets of liquid on a towel that suggested a recent spill hastily cleaned, and the faint scent of smoked paprika near the back window. Each anomaly felt intentional, yet the motive remained murky. When I returned to the brownstone that evening, Wolfe was in his chair, legs crossed, reading a culinary journal. He didn't look up as I entered, but I knew he was listening, waiting for my report. "The spice rack," I began, placing the folded note on his desk. "Someone tampered with it. Rearranged jars, slight smudges, and a hidden note that reads, 'I watched his reaction.'" He didn't flinch. Typical. He was already several moves ahead, his mind weaving a map from the fragments I presented. Wolfe set the journal aside and steepled his fingers. "Interesting," he murmured. "Subtle. Minimal force. Psychological imprint left on the environment. The hand that moved these jars is precise, calculated, and familiar with the rhythm of the kitchen. Tell me, Archie, which of our four suspects could move in such a manner without detection?" I considered Bernard's obsession with order could explain the precision, but he wouldn't leave a note. Lila's artistry could suggest subtlety, yet she wouldn't risk exposure. Thomas had mobility and charm, but his presence in the kitchen was limited. Reggie had both discretion and timing, but would he dare? The combinations were intriguing, and Wolfe's gaze bored into me as if daring me to make a misstep. "There's more," I added. The flour smears, the misaligned jars, the tiny liquid droplets, they all indicate someone is asserting control without being overtly seen. The note isn't just a threat, it's a demonstration of skill and awareness. Whoever did this understands the kitchen intimately. Wolfe's lips twitched, almost a smile. Excellent observation. You have identified method, intent, and knowledge. All that remains is to determine which of our subjects is capable of such nuanced action and who might have the motive to escalate from psychological disruption to actual removal of the chef. I made a mental note to shadow each suspect more closely. Wolfe's style demanded patience and precision. The moment for confrontation had not yet arrived, but the groundwork for revealing character, motive, and method was firmly in place. Later that night, as I reviewed my notes, I noticed a pattern I had initially overlooked. The small irregularities, spice jars, flour smears, liquid droplets aligned with the timing of Lila's brief absences and Thomas's wandering routes. Subtle, yet enough to create a lattice of suspicion. Reggie's movements were more consistent, suggesting that he was observing, not orchestrating. Bernard's intensity seemed directed toward compensating for chaos rather than creating it. I realized the kitchen had become a chessboard, with pieces moving silently under the gaze of a master strategist. Wolfe, and I was the pawn, moving exactly as instructed to provoke reactions, note anomalies, and feed information into the larger pattern. The day ended with the restaurant's lights dimming and a quiet tension settling over the neighborhood. Wolfe, as always, remained in his chair, immovable, silent, and infinitely calculating. He would wait for the next subtle breach, the next misplaced gesture, and use it to tighten the circle around the perpetrator. I could feel the invisible pressure building. The stage was set for subtle confrontations, indirect revelations, and the eventual unraveling of the mystery. The chef's disappearance was no longer a simple absence. It had become a test of intellect, patience, and psychological acuity. And Wolfe would, as always, ensure that justice, precise, deliberate, and immovable, was served. The next morning, I arrived at the restaurant to a scene that seemed ordinary at first glance. Early sunlight spilling over the counter, silverware gleaming, the faint aroma of fresh bread in the air. But anyone attuned to the subtleties, Wolfe included, would have noticed the tension. The rhythm of the staff was slightly off, small gestures repeated unnecessarily, as if each one were aware of a gaze they could not see. I started with Bernard, who was chopping vegetables at a pace bordering on manic. "Everything in order this morning?" I asked casually. He glanced up, jaw tight. "As always, but things feel different. Ever since Claude disappeared, it's tense." "Tense enough that someone might interfere with the supplies?" I prompted, watching his hands. They trembled ever so slightly. Bernard hesitated. "I don't know. I keep everything in check. But yes, something's not right." I made a note. Subtle unease, admitting vulnerability, but not culpability. Exactly the sort of thing Wolfe would want documented. Lila appeared rolling dough at her station. Her movements were meticulous, yet there was an underlying impatience in her gestures, a desire to finish quickly and move on. I noticed that a small tin of almond paste previously on a side shelf was missing, replaced by a slightly different container. I filed the observation in my mind It was minor, perhaps accidental, but the pattern of misplacements had begun to emerge. Thomas passed by with a tray, smiling at diners, but his eyes flickered toward the prep area as he moved. He was aware of the invisible scrutiny, and his slight stiffness suggested that he, too, felt the pressure. Reggie remained near the dish area, silent, his calm presence almost eerie. His methodical arrangement of plates, each aligned to millimeters, contrasted sharply with the slight chaos in the kitchen. Then came the real indicator that someone had escalated beyond mere psychological interference. I found a small drawer in the prep counter had been opened overnight, its contents, knives, utensils, and a few specialty tools disturbed. Nothing was missing, but the tampering was precise, almost taunting. Whoever did this had moved silently through the kitchen, leaving behind evidence that was subtle, yet unmistakable. I pocketed a tiny scrap of paper that had fallen from the drawer. Observe, prepare, adjust. The hands must follow orders, or chaos will reign. Clearly, the perpetrator was confident enough to escalate, knowing the staff's fear and precision would amplify the tension. This wasn't random mischief, it was strategic, calculated, and meant to convey a message. I made my rounds, observing the reactions. Bernard's eyes narrowed at the drawer, but he said nothing, adjusting the utensils and smoothing the counter as if to erase any trace. Lila's hands trembled slightly, flour dusting her fingers as she attempted to regain composure. Thomas's smile was tighter now, a mask stretched over suspicion and unease. Reggie, as always, remained an enigma, watching quietly, calculating, invisible, yet present. I returned to the brownstone to report. Wolfe was in his chair, as immovable as ever, the faint scent of pipe tobacco mingling with the aroma of a freshly polished floor. I laid out the details of the night's discoveries, the tampered drawer, the missing almond paste tin, the carefully placed notes, and the subtle behavioral shifts in the staff. Wolfe listened, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "The pattern emerges," he said finally. "Observe, disturb, intimidate. The perpetrator manipulates both the environment and personnel. Method, timing, and knowledge are all in play." "Excellent. Archie, Saul Panzer must be engaged. We need another pair of eyes, attentive, precise, capable of anticipating subtle cues the human mind might overlook. This has progressed beyond casual interference." I nodded. Calling Saul was easy. He was dependable, discreet, and exactly the kind of operative Wolfe relied on when the stakes increased. Within an hour, Saul arrived, quiet, efficient, and ready. I briefed him, emphasizing subtleties, displaced items, behavioral shifts, notes, and patterns. He listened, taking it all in with the focus of a seasoned professional. We returned to the restaurant, splitting duties. Saul focused on the back-of-house operations, tracking minor disturbances, noting unusual foot traffic, observing Reggie more closely. I circulated among the front-of-house staff, watching Bernard, Lila, and Thomas recording gestures, repetitions, and micro-expressions. By mid-afternoon, the pressure had visibly increased. Bernard's precision had turned almost obsessive, rearranging items multiple times, checking and rechecking surfaces. Lila's agitation manifested in quick, sharp movements and unnecessary flouring of trays. Thomas's charm was thin now, replaced by subtle signs of stress-tapping fingers, repeated straightening of uniform, glances toward the prep area. Reggie remained calm but appeared increasingly alert, eyes tracking each of us silently, perhaps calculating what we noticed and what we did not. A brief but telling incident occurred when a small stack of bowls tipped over near Bernard's station. He muttered under his breath, a rare lapse in composure, and immediately rearranged them with meticulous care, eyes darting around as if measuring someone's reaction. Lila looked at him sharply, hands frozen on the tray she was decorating, a faint flush rising in her cheeks. Thomas's casual chatter faltered mid-sentence. Reggie's calm hands adjusted the dishes without a word, silently restoring order. Back at the brownstone that evening, Wolfe received our reports with his usual impassivity, though the faintest flicker of interest crossed his eyes. "Pressure," he murmured. "Increasing, precise, psychological? Excellent. Patterns are forming. Now we will observe reactions, track deviations, and anticipate next steps. Archie, your role is observation, documentation, and timing. Saul will reinforce your vigilance. We must wait for the next subtle, perhaps invisible signal, and from that the truth will emerge." I left his presence with a renewed sense of purpose. The perpetrator had escalated and the stakes had risen. Each small disturbance, each subtle act of tampering was a calculated step toward revealing character, motive, and method. Wolfe's strategy was meticulous, relying on the psychological pressure we were now observing firsthand. And I knew that when the next subtle act occurred, the web of intrigue would tighten, leading us closer to the missing chef and the person behind the disruption. The brownstone had been disturbed, the restaurant destabilized, and the circle of suspects stretched under invisible scrutiny. Wolfe's methodical patience ensured that every observation would count, every subtle shift documented, and every misstep noted for later use. The game was advancing, the pieces moving into place, and I, as always, was caught in the motion, feeding intelligence to a mind that saw more than anyone else and would strike decisively when the time came. The brownstone felt unusually still that morning, the kind of calm that precedes decisive action. Wolfe sat in his chair, limbs folded, eyes narrowing as he listened to the city beyond the window without actually hearing it. I entered quietly, carrying my latest observations from the restaurant, Saul Panzer in tow, and laid the reports across his desk. "The disturbances continued," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Minor tampering, misaligned ingredients, subtle notes left for intimidation. Staff tension has intensified. Bernard's obsessive adjustments, Lila's anxious haste, Thomas's thinly veiled agitation, Reggie's silent observation patterns emerging, consistent with prior incidents." Wolfe's gaze lifted slowly, scanning the notes without touching them. "Indeed," he said, voice calm but weighted. "The next phase requires control over perception, Archie, not confrontation, but subtle orchestration. Our goal is to manipulate the environment such that the suspect, faced with inevitable exposure, reveals himself through behavior alone." I nodded, familiar with his approach. Wolfe's interventions are psychological symphonies. Every gesture, every timed inquiry, every suggestion of observation is intended to provoke an unrehearsed response. I was merely the instrument guided by his composition. "We will begin with timed appearances," Wolfe continued. "Saul, you will position yourself at the rear, observing staff as they enter and exit prep areas. Archie, you maintain visibility in the front, noting body language and micro-expressions. Each act must be precise, each pause intentional. Do not intervene. Simply allow the pressure to accrue." At the restaurant, we split duties. Saul's presence in the back kitchen was unobtrusive, but exacting. He noted the subtle misalignments, slight hesitations, and repeated glances that revealed the invisible strain among the staff. I circulated front of house, maintaining casual conversation while cataloguing gestures, phrasing, and reaction times. Bernard arrived first, early and meticulous. He began his routine, but now paused more frequently, checking supply lists, readjusting knives, and muttering softly to himself. I noted that each correction aligned with areas we had previously marked as tampered. The pressure was working. He felt observed, constrained, but did not know by whom. Lila's movements were increasingly erratic. She dropped a pastry briefly, her hands trembling, then recovered with an almost apologetic flourish. Each minor mistake seemed magnified, a subtle confession of distraction or anxiety. I observed carefully, recording every nuance. Thomas maintained his usual charm, interacting with diners with effortless grace. Yet the moment he glanced toward the kitchen, his smile faltered, and his hands tapped against the tray slightly faster than necessary. Timing and reaction are exactly the elements Wolfe wanted exposed. Reggie, ever silent, moved with calm precision. He arranged dishes, cleaned surfaces, and observed without comment. His behavior suggested patience, discipline, or possibly calculation. Saul noted him more closely, and I did the same from the dining area, marking each subtle deviation from routine. By mid-morning, the first deliberate act of Wolfe's positioning occurred. I received a quiet signal from Saul. Bernard had left a drawer slightly ajar, a mistake he would normally have corrected immediately. This exposed a habitual reaction, unguarded under indirect scrutiny. I moved closer, taking note of his hesitation, his glances toward the doorway, and the subtle clenching of his jaw. Wolfe's instructions were clear: record, observe, and allow the natural pressures of accountability and fear to shape behavior. The goal was not to confront, but to orchestrate revelation. Every person's response to observation would become a signal, each micro-expression a key to motive and method. A few minutes later, Lila dropped a tray of cupcakes. The sound echoed through the kitchen, minor, almost trivial, yet perfectly timed. Thomas and Bernard glanced simultaneously, tension visible in each posture. Reggie adjusted plates without comment, maintaining his air of calm observation. It was the subtle pressure Wolfe had intended, behavioral stress manifesting under controlled circumstances. During a brief lull, I approached Bernard casually. "Everything all right with the prep?" I asked. His eyes flickered, hesitation apparent. Yes, just a lot to manage today," he murmured. A slight tremor in his voice betrayed more than words could convey. I documented it, knowing Wolfe would pass every syllable, pause, and inflection. Lila approached the counter, adjusting her apron nervously. "I think I forgot a step in the frosting," she said, offering a tentative explanation. The admission, though small, indicated awareness of oversight under observation, exactly the type of psychological revealing Wolfe sought. Thomas wandered closer to the prep area, ostensibly to deliver a message to Bernard, yet his hand lingered near the counter where previous tampering had occurred. I noted the exact placement, timing, and glance. Each micro-action fed the pattern Wolfe had asked me to observe. Reggie, ever composed, continued silently, yet even he exhibited slight deviations, a subtle foot shuffle, a more deliberate placement of dishes, a prolonged pause before moving to the next station. Saul marked each observation, the two of us feeding a growing lattice of behavioral data to Wolfe's mind at the brownstone. By late afternoon, the pattern was clear. One of the staff, driven by ambition, fear, or hidden grievance, had begun to crack under indirect pressure. Wolfe's strategy of positioning and timed observation had set the stage. Subtle disruptions amplified under careful surveillance revealed tendencies, impulses, and potential motives without direct confrontation. Returning to the brownstone that evening, Wolfe reviewed our reports, reading each subtle note, timing, and gesture with surgical precision. "The circle tightens," he said. "Observe how micropressure exposes character. The method of disruption mirrors the method of removal. Soon we will provoke the critical action that identifies the perpetrator." I understood. The missing chef, the glove, the notes, the tampering, all part of a pattern Wolfe had now begun to exploit fully. The next act, subtle yet decisive, would reveal intention and capability. My role, as always, was to maintain vigilance, record every reaction, and feed it into the mind of a detective who never moved except to orchestrate justice. The brownstone remained a sanctuary of intellect, and Wolfe, in his immovable chair, was ready. Outside, the city continued unaware, but within our circle, the invisible pressure had been applied, and the game of observation, manipulation, and psychological revelation was advancing toward its inevitable conclusion. By the time the late afternoon sun slanted across the brownstone windows, Wolfe had made his decision. The subtle pressure we had applied at the restaurant had yielded enough irregularities, enough deviations from routine, that he was ready to begin the controlled confrontation. He summoned the 4 suspects to the office: Bernard, Lila, Thomas and Reggie along, with Miss Pembroke and her father. Saul and I were, as always, positioned strategically as observers, note-takers, and facilitators of the quiet tension Wolfe intended to wield. The suspects arrived with varying degrees of composure. Bernard's meticulous nature was evident in the careful folding of his hands, the slight tremor in his fingers betraying unease. Lila's elegant posture seemed to mask a storm of agitation. Her eyes flickered constantly, searching for subtle cues. Thomas, ever the charming facade, smiled too widely, words laced with forced ease. Reggie, silent, almost brooding, exuded an enigmatic calm, as if he already knew the course of events but waited for it to unfold. Wolfe remained in his chair, limbs folded, eyes surveying the room with precise calculation. The office, usually a sanctuary of intellectual calm, now hummed with the restrained energy of confrontation. He spoke only once at the outset. "You are all here because of recent events at Mr. Pembroke's establishment. Each of you had opportunity, and each of you had proximity. What follows is not accusation, but observation. Your reactions will illuminate truths hidden in the kitchen and beyond." The room fell silent, a silence so deliberate that it pressed against the walls and floor. Wolfe's presence alone was a lever of pressure, and every suspect felt it keenly. I began to report the patterns we had observed, not as a narrative, but as precise data: the displaced spice jars, flour smears, liquid droplets, subtle notes, and deviations in behavior. Wolfe absorbed every detail, his eyes narrowing, fingers steepled. Then, almost imperceptibly, he allowed the first probe to fall into place. "Bernard," Wolfe said calmly, "you arrived early, prepared the vegetables, and maintained strict control over the prep counters. Yet small misalignments were noted, followed by unusual pauses. Explain these." Bernard swallowed, gaze flicking toward the door, as if measuring the room for invisible witnesses. "I only reacted to minor mistakes," he said, adjusting knives, ingredients, trying to keep the kitchen in order. "And the note found behind the spices?" Wolfe asked, his tone precise, cutting through Bernard's deflection. "Some ingredients must vanish before the next service, or hands will be idle." "Did you write it?" Bernard hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I found it. I didn't touch it. I only tried to maintain order." Wolfe's gaze moved to Lila. "And you?" "Your movements were irregular. Flour dust, uneven pastries, glances at colleagues." "How do you explain these?" Tu was distracted. She stammered, voice soft. Concern for Claude and the kitchen mistakes happen. Concern or opportunity? Wolfe's eyes, dark and focused, pierced her composure. Lila faltered, hands clutching the edge of the table. "I only wanted to keep the kitchen running," she said, but the tremor in her voice betrayed more than words. Thomas, smiling now less convincingly, shifted in his chair. "I delivered messages, managed diners," he said. "I didn't," Wolfe interrupted. "Yet your glances toward the prep area, the slight accelerations of movement, the repeated inspections all suggest a familiarity with timing and presence. Observed deviations do not lie. Explain them." Thomas swallowed. "I only noticed things. I didn't interfere." Finally, Reggie, silent until now, straightened slightly. Wolfe's voice cut the tension. "And you move quietly, adjust plates precisely, observe without comment. Why?" Reggie's eyes met Wolfe's. "I watch, learn." I didn't move anything except what was needed. Wolfe nodded subtly. Indeed, observation and subtle adjustment. Yet a pattern persists, a note. Disrupted spices, tampered drawers, psychological pressure applied. One of you exerted this influence intentionally. The methods are precise, deliberate, and correspond to knowledge of the kitchen's micro-rhythms. I added quietly, "We've traced movement patterns, timing, and deviations across multiple days. Minor errors, small accidents, and micro-behavioral reactions have been catalogued. The pressure applied is clearly psychological, strategic, and calculated." The room shifted under the weight of this revelation. Bernard's hands clenched slightly. Lila's face flushed, a mixture of fear and defiance. Thomas's forced smile faltered completely. Reggie remained composed, yet his eyes reflected the faintest hint of calculation. Wolfe's voice then became surgical, calm yet unrelenting. The culprit is revealed not through assumption, but through response. The missing chef, the glove, the let-us-seek act required intimate knowledge, precise timing, and deliberate subtlety. Each of you exhibited reactions, but one among you orchestrated the sequence deliberately, exploiting fear and routine to convey control. The evidence, observed over days, points to a singular hand. He paused, allowing the weight of anticipation to settle in. "Bernard, Lila, Thomas, Reggie, consider your own reactions carefully. Truth cannot remain hidden when method, motive, and micro-behavior align. The brownstone observes, and so do we." The suspects exchanged glances, tension mounting, the psychological net closing slowly, inexorably. Wolfe's positioning had worked subtle pressure, observation, and the careful orchestration of micro-events had forced each individual into a position where their own actions illuminated the truth. The room was heavy with expectation, the kind of stillness that presses against the walls and the air like an unseen weight. Wolfe remained in his chair, legs crossed, eyes fixed on the four suspects, with that slow, deliberate gaze that seemed to pierce every pretense. I took a seat nearby, notebook in hand, ready to record the reactions that would confirm the trajectory Wolfe had been orchestrating for days. "Let us review," Wolfe began, his voice calm but exacting, cutting through the silence. "We have a missing chef, a severed glove, notes intended to intimidate, and subtle tampering within the kitchen environment. Each act required knowledge, precision, and timing. Each person present had proximity, opportunity, and motive. Yet only one individual's responses, when observed under applied pressure, aligned perfectly with the sequence of disturbances. I watched Bernard, his fingers nervously tapping the table, eyes darting between Wolfe and his colleagues. Lila's hands fidgeted, flour dusting the tips of her fingers despite her attempt at composure. Thomas's forced grin had faded entirely, revealing tight, pale lips. Reggie remained calm, but the slightest narrowing of his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. Wolfe continued. The first clue was the glove, deliberately placed to unsettle. Only someone familiar with the chef's routine, his timing, and his habits could know how to maximize the psychological effect. Minor discrepancies, spice jars, flour smears, liquid droplets, and tampered drawers served as signals and tests. The reactions of the staff were meticulously documented. One person's behavior, under sustained observation, consistently indicated familiarity, anticipation, and intentionality. That person, faced with scrutiny, revealed subtle slips, hesitations, involuntary gestures, and minor verbal contradictions. He leaned forward slightly, voice sharpening with precision. "Bernard, your obsessive adjustments, repeated rechecking of knives and micro-reactions to minor disruptions were noted. Lila, your trembling, uneven pastries and anxiety-laden glances suggested stress but not orchestration. Thomas, your charm faltered under scrutiny, revealing awareness but not control. Reggie, silent yet methodical, demonstrated composure, alignment with patterns and calculated restraint. Yet within this careful orchestration, one set of deviations aligns perfectly with the deliberate tampering and intimidation sequence. I could see the tension rising. Bernard's jaw tightened, Lila's hands clasped together. Thomas's eyes flickered toward Reggie, uncertainty edging his posture. Reggie, still quiet, met Wolfe's gaze directly, unflinching yet attentive. Wolfe's voice grew softer, almost conversational, but each word landed with undeniable weight. The missing chef was not taken in haste. His absence is a product of careful planning, designed to allow subtle manipulations within the kitchen to exert control over the remaining staff. The glove, notes, and disturbances are signatures. Only one individual possesses the knowledge, precision, and opportunity to execute such a strategy while maintaining the appearance of innocence. A tense pause, then Wolfe's eyes settled on Thomas. Thomas, the waiter. Your movements, timing, and reactions demonstrate both awareness and opportunity. The glances toward the prep area, the accelerations in routine, and the subtle micro-adjustments to your interactions align with the disruptions observed. You acted to unsettle, manipulate, and ultimately remove Claude from the environment. The glove and notes were your instruments. The tampering was your method. Admit it. Thomas's face blanched, the charm evaporating entirely. His voice came out in a thin, defensive whisper. I only what? Wolfe's tone remained calm but unyielding. Only exploit weaknesses for personal gain? Only impose psychological control? Only orchestrate the removal of a colleague to satisfy ambition? Every act has been observed, every inconsistency noted, every hesitation documented. You cannot deny the pattern. Thomas's shoulders slumped, the defiance drained. Yes, it was me, he admitted finally, voice low and quivering. I wanted the promotion, the recognition. I thought if Claude was gone, I could step up, prove myself. Wolfe's eyes didn't soften, but a hint of satisfaction flickered. Motivation established, method established, pattern confirmed. Opportunity coincides with execution. Your orchestration of intimidation and removal has been revealed by your own reactions, under controlled pressure applied subtly over several days. You have exposed yourself by your behavior, not by force, not by confession, but through the logical consequences of your actions under observation. Thomas swallowed, gaze dropping. I didn't mean it was supposed to be temporary, just a scare I didn't. You manipulated, threatened, and removed, Wolfe said precisely. Whether intended as temporary or permanent is irrelevant to the sequence of deliberate acts. Justice, in this sense, is served not by intent alone, but by recognition of truth and accountability. You are responsible for the disruption, the disappearance, and the psychological toll on your colleagues. I watched as Miss Pembroke and her father absorbed the revelation. Relief mixed with astonishment. Bernard exhaled, tension easing slightly. Lila's lips trembled, a mixture of anger and vindication. Reggie, the silent observer, seemed almost satisfied, his calm presence a stark contrast to Thomas's unravelling. Wolfe stood, moving slowly to the window, surveying the city beyond as if drawing finality from the distant streets. The circle of observation has revealed the offender. Method, motive, and opportunity converge. The kitchen's order disrupted through subtle, psychological means has been restored in the sense that the truth is now visible. He turned to the Pembrokes. Your chef will be located. The disruption, while serious, has been revealed and addressed. What remains is corrective action and moral accounting. The The sequence of events demonstrates not only ambition unchecked, but the vulnerability of systems under psychological pressure. Observe always that intellect alone is insufficient. Ethics and character define the consequences of action. Thomas sat quietly, head bowed, acknowledging exposure without further protest. Bernard and Lila exchanged brief, relieved glances. Reggie's calm composure remained intact. And in the corner I made my notes, recording the final reactions, the subtle relief, and the quiet satisfaction that Wolfe once again had executed his method with perfect precision. Wolfe finally returned to his chair, adjusting the folds of his suit with characteristic precision. Observation complete. Justice enacted through knowledge and control. The brownstone's order, momentarily disturbed, is now restored. Archie, ensure the details are recorded for posterity and notify authorities to facilitate appropriate resolution. I nodded, closing my notebook. The mystery of the chef's disappearance and the calculated disruptions had been resolved, revealed not through force, but through the meticulous psychological application of intellect, the hallmark of Wolfe's method. The brownstone returned to its familiar rhythm that evening, quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional scrape of a chair, as Fritz moved with deliberate care in the kitchen. Wolfe sat immobile in his chair, eyes half closed, as if the day's intellectual exertions were akin to a fine meal slowly digested. I settled into my spot nearby, my own notes carefully organized, reflecting the hours of observation, interviews, and documentation that had led us to Thomas's exposure. The Pembrokes had left shortly after Wolfe concluded the final interrogation, and the 4 staff members had returned to a semblance of normalcy at the restaurant. Claude, the missing chef, had been located at a quiet boarding house nearby, unharmed but shaken, and arrangements were being made for his safe return. The psychological disruption he had endured was nearly as serious as the physical absence itself, and the staff were learning to navigate the restored order. Wolfe finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, and carrying the weight of his usual moral precision. Justice, he said, does not rely on punitive measures alone. It requires recognition of the patterns of conduct, an understanding of motive, and the restoration of equilibrium in the environment. The kitchen, temporarily unbalanced, now resumes its function because those responsible have been exposed. I glanced at him, noting the rare hint of satisfaction in his expression. "And Thomas?" I asked. "He'll face consequences, I assume." Wolfe's eyes flicked toward me, unwavering. Consequences are the natural result of behavior. His position is compromised, his ambition curtailed. The system he sought to manipulate remains intact only because it is now aware of the vulnerabilities he exploited. Ethics, Archie, always govern the outcome, whether formalized by law or enforced by observation. Fritz entered, bearing a tray with a light supper, perfectly arranged plates, a steaming pot of soup, and a fresh loaf of bread. He moved with his usual precision, placing each item in exactly the right spot, maintaining the sacred order of the brownstone, even in the wake of disruption. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the aroma a welcome contrast to the tension that had filled the air all day. Wolfe remained silent, cutting bread with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes distant yet attentive to the details, as if evaluating the moral fabric of the case alongside the physical meal before him. "Archie," he said finally, breaking the silence, observed not just the resolution, but the subtleties. Note how minor acts of ambition, unchecked by ethical consideration, can ripple through an entire system. Observe the restoration of equilibrium, the reactions of those involved, and the latent lessons embedded in human behavior. This is as important as the recovery of a missing individual. I nodded, appreciating the rare combination of intellectual rigor and philosophical reflection Wolfe always managed to weave into his conclusions. It was part of what made working with him both exhausting and exhilarating, the requirement to see not only the facts, but the moral and psychological currents that guided them. We ate in silence for a while. The only sounds were the occasional clink of cutlery and the soft murmur of Fritz moving about the kitchen. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware that a carefully orchestrated psychological drama had unfolded and reached resolution in a single, controlled apartment. After supper, Wolfe reclined in his chair, fingers steepled once more. "The case demonstrates," he said thoughtfully, "that the human element, when manipulated through subtle psychological pressure, can reveal truths invisible to casual observation. Methodical surveillance, careful orchestration, and awareness of behavioral patterns are the instruments through which clarity emerges." I leaned back in my chair, allowing the weight of the day's events to settle. "And the staff?" I asked. "They're all back in line?" "Yes," Wolfe replied. "Order restored through exposure, observation, and the unavoidable consequences of ambition misapplied. They have been reminded of boundaries, responsibilities, and the necessity of integrity in the face of opportunity. The lessons are subtle but permanent." I glanced at him, noting the faintest hint of indulgence in his expression, a small acknowledgement of satisfaction in the completion of his method. Wolfe rarely expressed overt emotion, but when the equilibrium of the brownstone was preserved and justice enacted with minimal disruption beyond the necessary exposure, he allowed himself a quiet approval. As the evening deepened, the light in the brownstone softened, casting long shadows across the furniture and walls. Wolfe finally spoke again, in a tone of reflection rather than instruction. "Ambition untempered by ethics is the source of disorder. Observation, control, and logical deduction restore not only truth, but the balance disturbed by human folly. Remember, Archie, intelligence without moral calibration is an instrument of chaos." I sipped my coffee, letting the weight of his words sink in, aware that this was the kind of philosophical closure Wolfe prized, a meditation on ethics, intellect, and human behavior, wrapped in the practical satisfaction of having resolved the immediate crisis. "Justice served," I muttered, more to myself than to Wolfe, with a side of perfectly cooked soup. I allowed myself a small grin. Wolfe did not respond to the quip, but the faint twitch of a corner of his mouth suggested that even he could appreciate the occasional levity when order had been restored. The brownstone, disturbed for only a short time, now hummed with its usual rhythm of calm, observation, and intellectual rigor. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious, while within a precise equilibrium had been achieved.